Welcome, everybody. I'm Michael Herger, and I'm here to tell you about our project called Building Capacity to Support the Pandemic's Unsung Heroes, Frontline Essential Food Service Workers. You can post any comments in the chat or email them to me. So my background is that I'm a researcher at Tulane, and I primarily help people deal with difficult decisions about health or healthcare. And I really got interested in the pandemic because I saw this as an opportunity to help people with the many decisions that they're having to face. We know that the start of the pandemic was a very difficult time in New Orleans, in particular. And so you probably remember how stressful the week was when the World Health Organization made the pandemic declaration. And on March 11th, you probably remember lots of meetings and events being canceled. And New Orleans was one of the first places to have very strict orders, including the stay-at-home order. And we were one of the first large cities to really be hit by the pandemic in the US. And so it was a traumatic time for everybody here in a lot of different ways. And it's something that continued on. There have been different restrictions throughout the pandemic, and people have had their health affected and dealt with all sorts of consequences. And even recently, this has caused a number of major problems with IDA and all the challenges that's posed too. So this was a major challenge at the beginning, has continued to be a major challenge. And then there have been new difficulties with the hurricane as well that have especially hit New Orleans. So today I'm here to tell you about our project. We'll go through why we're focused on food service workers specifically, the project emphasis, and leadership and objectives, examples of how research works, our project plan, and upcoming events. This project specifically focuses on food service workers. This can be people in any sort of food-related occupation where they're having some interaction with other people. It could be restaurants and grocery stores, but also cafeterias, anyone in food delivery or doing any sort of food prep or food-related work where they're having to interact with other people, because these are frontline essential occupations. These are not always the occupations that people think of. Often people are thinking of healthcare, but a lot of the risks that people have faced are similar in these circumstances and at times more difficult as well. Here we've outlined some of the challenges faced by food service workers. At the start of the pandemic, this was really the first group of people that were at increased risk of exposure to the coronavirus because we just didn't know enough about the virus at that point in time. Cases actually peaked in New Orleans before we knew that there was any sort of need for masking, before there was a national mask mandate. And at any time the restrictions were lifted, often people in the food service industry were the first to experience that increased risk of exposure. What if we get rid of masks entirely? What if we increase occupancy limits? Often this was falling on people who were in highly social occupations. In addition to these health-related risks, there's been an enormous financial impact on the food service industry in New Orleans. Many places have gone out of business or had to cut hours. People have expressed concerns about not getting back pay. A number of people have lost health insurance, and people have faced additional challenges related to schools being closed or having to take on new debts and all of these sorts of issues. In addition to this, there are ongoing challenges people face surrounding vaccinations. And so for managers, there are challenges around vaccine requirements at work. People are also facing decisions about vaccines themselves, for their family members, and increasingly for children. This will get more complicated over time because additional doses of vaccines are being recommended for some groups. One of the challenges at the start of the availability of vaccines was that people who were working in food service occupations were not often eligible to get vaccines right away. And with the recent changes about additional doses for vaccines, people who work in food services are included among this initial group that are being recommended for additional vaccine doses. And that was something that barely happened before. So With the initial rollout of vaccines, food service workers were kind of left behind. And then in this recent round of decision making about additional doses, there was some back and forth where the FDA said, we think people in higher risk occupations should have access to these additional doses. The CDC advisor said, we don't think so. And then the CDC director ultimately said that people should. So it was close, but there's been some improvement in policy surrounding these issues. In addition to the health-related issues, the financial and the vaccine issues, there's just been a lot of stress for people working in the food service industry, stress about health, about finances, about difficult interactions with customers and industry on every level. The cost of food has tripled since the beginning of the pandemic. This has caused a domino effect where restaurants and private caterers have had to increase their prices. And so in addition to the health consequences, this is an example of some of the financial consequences where costs are just soaring. And another person mentioned our income is so dependent on tourism. In fact, New Orleans is number 3 in the country for reliance on tourism. Without the city in full swing, we're constantly in a state of uncertainty. I haven't been able to afford insurance during the pandemic, and I know there are many others in the same boat. And so this is relating the challenges surrounding lost revenue and lost profit for businesses, and that having an immediate impact on people who are working in this area, losing insurance and having lower pay and other sorts of problems. Another quote, it's still very obvious a lot of people we depend on just don't feel confident dining out. How do we get people back? How do we get people to return? The people doing marketing need guidance in navigating this dynamic. And another person said, as businesses, we're recovering and adjusting to a new normal. Out of nowhere comes the mandate requiring the vaccination cards be shown to enter. A lot of restaurants are already short-staffed due to the vaccine requirement. And so you've got a lot of shifting dynamics. People are trying to make things safe, but this is also imposing challenges. And so how do people navigate all of this in a way that allows them to stay profitable and make employees safe and make customers safe and move forward? Another person said the emotional stresses are massively draining as well. A lot of self-medicating going on because no one in my boat can afford mental therapy or guidance. The uncertainty creates depression and anxiety that's gone unchecked for nearly 2 years now. So this is really having a long-term effect on people's mental health. So back in May, when much of the US was starting to get excited that the pandemic was improving with the rollout of vaccines, we were still very concerned about the long-term trajectory of the pandemic. And so we submitted a research proposal targeting 3 areas where we're trying to help people in the food service sector. The project will target 3 main sorts of problem areas. One problem area is health and safety. How do we help people with decisions around vaccines, masking, other sorts of precautions in restaurants and grocery stores and other food service areas? How do we help people working in this environment deal with stress, the anxiety, the depression, anger, bereavement if they've lost someone? And how do we help people deal with the long-term impact of the pandemic? So I'll describe the project leadership. We have a steering committee that is overseeing the project. The project will last for 1.5 years, and our goal is to get additional project funding to carry this on long term. We have representatives from the food service industry. We have business owners. We have families and schools involved because this is affecting people beyond just the workers themselves. Their families and schools are affected by any health concerns and stress and long-term financial impact. And let me bring my screen up. So I'm Mike, and if you go to our website, NOLA19.com, you can feel free to email me at any point and ask questions or learn how you can get more involved. My role in the project is mainly working with people who are in the food service industry themselves and with business owners. And I'll ask Courtney to introduce herself too.
Hi, everyone. My name is Courtney Baker. I'm happy to be here. I'm a child and family psychologist, and I'm at Tulane University. I'm co-lead on the project, and I'm thrilled to be working with this team. In my role, I'll be focusing on understanding the needs and concerns of family members of food service workers including those related to health, safety, stress, well-being, everything that's on all of our minds here in New Orleans as we continue to resume in-person activities related to jobs, childcare, and in-person schooling. Thanks.
Thanks. And Beth, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Beth Nauman, and I'm Director of Health Services Research at Louisiana Public Health Institute. And LPHI is a non-governmental organization based in New Orleans. We work in partnership with other community-based organizations, with community members, and healthcare systems in Louisiana and across the Gulf Coast and even nationwide, with our mission to impact and improve health for all in the region. Within LPHI, I oversee our health services research division, where we partner with several health systems in Louisiana, as well as a few other states, to conduct multi-site clinical research. And as part of that work, we have a strong stakeholder engagement component where we reach out to and engage community members and the general public in healthcare research. And so what we try to learn from the community is what matters most to their own experience with their health and their own experience with healthcare and treatment that they may need. And also what research questions would address the things that matter most to people. So we really try to partner with the community to bring that perspective to the research community and the healthcare community to address the needs of the population. So as a partner in this project with colleagues at Tulane, I am helping to inform the strategy for engaging the community members, particularly in the food services industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth, and thanks, Courtney. And in addition to Courtney and Beth, if you interact with us in the project, you may hear from a student named Ken, and there's a whole group of students behind the scenes who are designed to help support every aspect of the project. We'll hear shortly from one of those students, Addison, but continuing on, just to describe some of our objectives of this project. In particular, over the next year and a half, we have three main objectives. One is we're developing this multi-stakeholder collaborative. We're looking to engage the community on these three problem areas of health and safety, stress, and the long-term impact of COVID. And then we're looking to develop a strategic plan to address these problems over the long term, because this is a 1.5-year project, and we're looking to gain funding to develop larger, longer-term research projects to support people in the food service industry as the pandemic goes forward. So our main three problem areas are health and safety, stress, and the long-term impact. That's what this project is focused on. But before we go into more detail about where this project could go, we wanted to give the community sort of an overview of how research can help the food service industry in general. And so Addison is going to present on 3 examples of research projects that were designed to help people working in the food service industry. Addison.
Hi, everyone. I'm Addison. I'm a junior at Tulane, and I'm excited to begin working on this project as well. I've gathered some research examples that demonstrate the necessity of the food service industry and their role in research. My first research example studied food safety practices. The study involved receiving input from food service workers to implement new food safety interventions. In general, food service workers agree that it's difficult to practice food safety and hygiene given the stressful environment and time pressure of food service. So this study used the opinions and perceptions of food service workers to develop better food safety interventions, such as preventing understaffing and providing enough gloves for sanitation purposes. My second example involves research conducted to directly benefit food service workers and required their involvement in a randomized control trial. 2 servers waited in diners and either boxed or did not box customers' leftovers, and tipping patterns were observed. The research supported that food servers earned higher tips when they boxed customers' leftovers compared to when customers were given the box to do it themselves. My last example incorporates the impact of COVID on food service workers. Food service workers in particular were exploited during the pandemic, subjected to unsanitary conditions and stress. So this study examined how society at large has come to recognize the importance of food service workers during the pandemic, so heightening their occupational value. This study is similar to our project, and that its aim is to bring attention to the unsung heroes of the pandemic in the food service industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Addison. I appreciate you sharing those examples. And those are representative of the types of studies that are out there in the food service industry. I particularly like the one focused on tips because we could brainstorm 100 things that could affect what level of a tip somebody would give, and they might all seem perfectly logical, but unless you test them out, you don't actually know what works. And so in our project, I mentioned we're focused on these 3 problem areas of health and safety, stress-related issues, and the long-term impact of COVID. And that's what we're focused on the next year and a half, is really understanding what those 3 problems are. And we laid out a proposal where we said those are 3 important areas where people in the food service industry are being affected, but we need input from the community on the specifics. What is it like dealing with that stress? How is this affecting you specifically? Is it more about anxiety? Are people having panic attacks? Are they dealing with angry interactions with customers? What are the specific concerns that people are mostly dealing with during the course of the pandemic? And as we can start to pinpoint what those problems are, we can then begin to focus on a proposal for the next project, which would largely focus on how do we best address those problems. And this would involve coming up with 2 or more different ways of trying to improve those problems to make life better for people in the food service industry. And so, for example, imagine that the pandemic gets worse. Imagine that there is a viral variant that evades the current vaccines largely, and we're in a much worse situation in 6 months from now. What do we do about health and safety at restaurants or grocery stores? And we could come up with a lot of different ways of trying to improve health and safety, and we could come up with interventions that might even be similarly successful. But an additional question would be, how can we do that in a way that is supporting people's health, but is also supporting the industry's finances so they can maintain profitability? And how is it good for customers so that customers are not just safe, but are also feeling safe and feeling comfortable in those sorts of environments? And when we can come up with what the key problems are, then we can start to define solutions, and then we can test those solutions, and that's what the research process would look like. But we need community input in order to do this effectively. So we have this proposed project where we've outlined the 3 main areas we're focused on, but we will actually customize this research project in a couple of ways based on community feedback and based on the state of the pandemic. So we're getting community feedback in a number of different ways. The steering committee that's overseeing this project is about half community members and half researchers. And we're also hosting community events like this so that people can learn about the project and keep up to date on what we're doing. We're going to host a survey of people who are working in the food service industry. We'll conduct a series of focus groups and interviews to learn more about the issues that people are facing. And we also have a website and social media where people can stay apprised to what we're working on and also give a lot of feedback. In addition to community input, one thing that was unique about this proposal is we tried to account for the different scenarios that the pandemic could take. And so we used an approach called scenario planning to outline how we might focus on these different problem areas depending on what the nature of the pandemic looks like. And so when you do scenario planning, usually you try to think of 2 key issues that are uncertain in the future. And 2 issues that we found based on stakeholder input from the community, based on surveys of epidemiologists who study this issue, are 2 main areas of uncertainty. And this was something that we wrote about when we submitted the proposal back in May. And so some of this understanding has evolved a bit, but we were really uncertain about what would the level of vaccination uptake look like in the US and throughout the world. And on one end, on the left side of this blue arrow, you can imagine really poor uptake where people don't want to get vaccines, or there are geographic pockets where people don't want vaccines, or there's a really slow rollout of vaccines to children and especially young children, or poor understanding surrounding additional doses or booster shots, if those were recommended. And we didn't even know back in May if that would be something that was recommended or for whom. On the other end, you could imagine vaccinations going really well, high rates nationally. We start rolling out vaccines around the world. Kids are getting vaccines early, and there's very little hesitancy from parents. And if and when booster shots were recommended, people would go out and would get those right away. And so there was a continuum, and there was a lot of uncertainty around that. The other key consideration was viral variants. And so at the top of this green arrow, you can imagine problematic viral variants where we have new variants of the virus evolving that are partially or even completely evading existing vaccines. On the flip side of that, you can imagine that there are no serious variants, that any variation in viruses that evolve, we're still protected from those through existing vaccines, and that it's not much of an issue. And so in each one of these quadrants, upper left, upper right, bottom left, bottom right, you can imagine the different scenarios. So the upper left would be there's poor uptake of vaccines and there's problematic variants. And the bottom right would be there's no really problematic variants and people are really good about their vaccines. And so we tried to imagine what things would look like under these different scenarios, which is obviously very difficult. But we brainstormed this in detail. And if you want to, you can pause the recording of this video and you can review all of this closely. But basically the upper left is sort of the worst case scenario. We're calling this stuck in a nightmare. This is where there's very poor uptake of vaccines. And then on top of that, there start to be problematic variants that are evading vaccines. And so this is kind of like being back to square one of where things were pre-vaccine, aside from having more knowledge about vaccines and distancing and other sorts of preventive measures. But here, this would be a crisis mode. We'd be focused on getting people vaccines, getting people booster shots, dealing with acute mental health issues of depression and anxiety and social isolation again, and suicidality and all this sorts of stuff. So really acute crisis. In the bottom right, it's more of a rosy scenario of redefining normal. Here we've got widespread uptake of vaccines, and there's no new variants on the way. And so this is kind of redefining normal or returning to normal or a post-pandemic normal. And in those circumstances, what we'd be able to do is focus more on longer term sorts of issues, like how do we help people who've had COVID and are experiencing long-term symptoms? How do we deal with long-term financial repercussions? How do we deal with lingering mental health issues? How do we deal with issues surrounding tourism with people who are traveling from other countries, if people are coming from other countries where vaccinations aren't so great? And then we've considered a number of scenarios in between. And one of them is if there's lower uptake of vaccines, but there are no trivial, if there are only trivial variants. And this is kind of where we're at right now in this scenario C of crawling to the finish line. We're slowly getting more people vaccinated, but it's not going as quickly as we could hope. And there haven't, of late, been any variants that are escaping our vaccines. The Delta variant was obviously a major problem, but our vaccines continue to offer good protection against the variants that we have. And so we've tried to consider the project from a number of different perspectives, and we will continue to do this as the pandemic evolves, but know that this is something we're prepared for. If the pandemic gets much worse again, we will be prepared for that and try to make it a better scenario than when the pandemic began. And if things are moving toward a rosier path, that's excellent. And we're going to deal with the lingering pandemic-related issues too. So in closing, I would just like to note some of our upcoming events. In November, there will be a monthly, semi-monthly steering committee meeting. We will be doing steering committee meetings every other month through the next year and a half. In December, we will host another event like this. Presumably, it will be virtual unless the state of the pandemic has greatly improved. And that will be focused on community research partnerships. So if you are a researcher, how do you better partner with the community? And if you are somebody in the community who does not have much of a research background, how do you get more involved with this project and understand the basics of what we're trying to do from a research perspective, if that's something that you're less familiar with, which is totally fine. In February, we will have a survey of food service workers to try to better understand the issues they're facing surrounding health and safety, stress, long-term impact of the pandemic, and other pandemic-related issues. And in April, we will hold the first of 3 focus groups. So if you're interested in any of these activities or just want to learn more, or if you have a friend or coworker interested in these topics, feel free to direct them to our website, NOLA19.com, and my contact information is on there. I'm Mike, and they can email me, and I'm happy to chat with them. So thank you for listening. At this point, we can take any questions that may have come up. I see 2 questions that came in. One question is, can I get involved with the project if I'm not in New Orleans? And yes, you can. The project itself is focused on people in the food service industry in New Orleans. However, if you are not in New Orleans, if you are in another area, you are welcome to get involved with the project and learn from what we're doing and contribute in some capacity. Another question, how do I get involved? You can just shoot me an email if you want to learn more, but I encourage you to go to our website as well, NOLA19.com, and we have another video posted on there, and I will post this video later today, but you should be able to see it on YouTube in the meantime. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate you attending.